ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Adam Liaw is here today. In my house, when Adam Liaw says something about food, we listen. And I think that's become true for so many Australians. Adam Liaw was raised on the insanely delicious Nonya food of Malaysia and Singapore. I'm talking about laksa, satay, nasi lemak, chicken rice, beef rendang, popiah, roti canai, ayam curry, asam fish, Singapore chili crab. I'd better stop there. Then a stint in Japan immersed Adam in Japanese food and language and culture. Since winning Masterchef way back in 2010, Adam has presented several series of Destination Flavour and The Cook-Up on SBS, as well as a podcast on the history of food. And Adam has now become a revered national figure in Australia for redeeming the holy ingredient of chicken salt from the outer darkness and placing it back on our chips where it belongs. Hello, Adam.
G'day, Richard. How are you?
Fine, sir. I'm well. I thought, for a bit of research, I'd better watch Destination Flavour in Singapore with my wife, who's from Singapore originally, and we ended up watching the whole damn series last night. So thanks for that. I was supposed to get stuff done.
You're one ahead of me. You know, quite often I do not watch the shows that I've made because obviously I've lived it and then also spend a lot of time in post-production. By the time it actually gets to the screen, I'm like, no, I think I've seen enough.
You like me? I hate watching myself on TV. I tend to leave the room if I'm on. Are you a bit like that as well?
I've kind of gotten over it. I think once you're a product of reality TV, you've seen yourself at your absolute worst, and nothing can be as embarrassing or humiliating as that process. So you actually kind of get okay with the idea of seeing yourself embarrass yourself on television. You
can cook in your underpants on TV and feel fine about it. As part of that series in Singapore, you showed us this box, and inside was a very old family handwritten cookbook. Tell me about this cookbook.
Well, it wasn't even a cookbook. It was. I think it's like a planner from the very early 70s, and it's just my mum had used this book as a record of recipes that she wanted to try out and keep. And some of them are clipped from newspapers, some of them are handwritten in there, some of them are, it covers the period from when we came to Australia. So there's early recipes from the Women's Weekly in sort of the very early 80s in there. And so it's this collection of a lot of the things that interested my mum in food through most of her life. She would have been in her early 20s when she started writing the book, and then probably wrote it through until the pressures of motherhood in the mid-80s became too much, and then stopped around there.
What kind of sense memories does it invoke to go through an old family cookbook like that?
I actually credit it as being one of the most useful cookbooks I have philosophically, I guess, because there was this, the chili sauce that you have with Hainanese chicken rice. It's been an absolute staple in my household for my entire life, and I could never get it right. I'd Googled, researched recipes of how to do it, and then constantly it just wasn't tasting right. I'd seen it made a million times, literally a million times, possibly. The sound of it being made, my grandmother sitting on the step pounding it in mortar and pestle, but for some reason I could not get this bloody recipe right. And then I found the recipe for it in my mum's cookbook, and it was a list of 5 ingredients.
What are those ingredients?
Garlic, chili, citrus juice, whether it's lime or lemon, ginger, and salt and sugar. And that was it. That was the recipe. And then the briefest of methods of just pound together and then season to taste. No measurements, no nothing, just a list of the ingredients and the recipe, which is literally, I was like, oh, what a shame. I already knew this. And then it just dawned on me like, oh, I already know this. And from that point, I've made it correctly. And it tastes right. Just instead of trying to follow a method or a process, just follow what you know about this thing that you've eaten your entire life. And it dawned on me, like, I've been so stupid thinking that there was this particular balance of ingredients or volumetric measure that I had to crack to get this right. Whereas it was something that I'd seen made so many times without ever being measured and without the overlay of a recipe put over it.
You mentioned Hainan chicken rice. This is something that I like my wife to make for me when I'm ill. It's deceptively simple, but very, very, very complex. How often was this cooked in the family home for you when you were a kid?
Once a week, I'd say. Usually a Sunday lunch type dish for us, and then there's always with a lot of those regular recipes, there's the Hainanese chicken rice, and then there's the secondary dish that follows from any leftovers there get fried together with some dark soy sauce and a bit of extra ginger and things.
It's a poached chicken. There's a chicken broth that goes with it. There's rice that's cooked in the chicken stock and a series of sauces. How do you like to make chicken rice?
I'll give you the brief. So I cut the fat deposits out of the chicken, then make a very sort of heavily seasoned broth, and that's with a lot of aromatic salt and a bit of MSG. Poach the chicken in the broth, take the fat, render that out, use the fat and a bit of garlic and shallot to fry some rice, then use the stock that's made from the chicken to cook the rice with some pandan, season that again, and then make a couple of sauces to go with it. The chili sauce that we've spoken about, and then also a more Cantonese-style ginger and spring onion sauce, which is basically just ginger and spring onion pounded together with some salt and some very hot oil poured over the top.
See, even as you were saying that, I was getting this odd feeling of warmth going through me. Like, I don't know, that feeling I associate with chicken rice, that feeling of feeling scented and better and feeling warm as well.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a really comforting recipe to me, not just because I enjoy eating it, because it's probably the one dish that I've cooked the most in my life.
Singaporeans are the most food-obsessed people. I've had much more so even than Italians, I think.
Absolutely. I think food is such an important part of cultural identity. You know, we hear the memes about Italians being obsessed with food, but actually that has come a lot more from the large amount of post-war migration that left Italy. And so you have a lot of migrants out there essentially evangelizing authenticity in Italian food, actually far more than people in actual Italy do. And Singapore, I think, is largely the same because they gained independence quite late in the grand scheme of countries in this world. My mum would have been, I think, in her late teens.
This is 65, isn't it?
Yeah.
They've done well, though, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, and food obviously has become such a strong part of Singaporean identity.
It's known as Hainan chicken rice,
yes.
This dish. Now, you have ancestors from Hainan, and yet is it famous in Hainan, or what's its origins? What do you know about the origins?
It's starting to get a little bit more famous there. Generally, my rule of thumb is if something has the name of a place in the title, it is not from that place. So Singapore noodles are a Cantonese dish, not from Singapore.
French fries are American, aren't they?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or Belgian, depending on who you want to ask. But Hainanese chicken rice was essentially a dish based on a very famous Hainanese dish called wenchangji, which is wenchang, the chicken from wenchang. And it not so much a dish per se, but the actual bird itself, very, very famous. Hainan as an island is kind of a gourmet center, and they are very famous for particular things, a particular type of lamb, a particular type of crab, a particular type of chicken that is fed on peanut husks and those kind of things. And so a lot of the migration from China down through Southeast Asia came kind of geographically. You had people further north around that Teochew areas and things going a little bit earlier. And the Hainanese were one of the last waves of migration. So when they arrived in Southeast Asia, there weren't many jobs going around. So many Hainanese became cooks and chefs, just like my grandfather. He was one of those migrants in the 1920s. And so Hainanese chicken rice was essentially this Malaysian Singaporean adaptation of this very famous type of chicken in Hainan by Hainanese cooks in Southeast Asia.
My theory is that my wife's a really good cook of a whole range of cuisines, just as you are, Adam. And my theory on that is because that part of the world, the Straits of Malacca around Malaysia, are such an intersection of peoples and culture and food, the roads out of there to other cuisines are really easy to follow. Like there's a good road that takes you to Portuguese food. There's a road that takes you to Indian food. There's a road that takes you to Chinese food and even British food to some degree as well. What do you think of that theory?
I think it's a very good theory. I'd go even further, though. You know, that those Peranakan settlements areas, essentially the Chinese traders who settled in, I mean, we know the Peranakans as being from that Straits area, Malacca, Penang, where I'm from, Singapore. Those were the important trading ports, but they do extend a bit further north into Thailand and things and so forth. But they were really the ports where what we understand as global cuisine started. You know, before that, there wasn't this movement of cuisines around. People in Persia ate Persian food, and people in China ate Chinese food, regional Chinese food. And then once you had those maritime spice routes that brought mainly spices from India around through to Europe and other goods from Europe around the other side to Southeast Asia, China, etc., that's when we started to understand that cuisines could change and could change because of external influence, because usually they would have changed kind of, I'm talking post-Columbian exchange when Columbus brought tomatoes and potatoes and everything from the Americas to Europe. The maritime trade routes from India were really what made global cuisine what it is today.
Now, this is something you've done a fair bit of research on. I've written books on ancient and medieval history in particular. And I keep going to the Silk Roads again and again and again. And the more I think about it, it's very easy to see the longing for food as the engine of history, the engine of change in history.
Absolutely. If you look at the history of agriculture, since we became an agricultural civilization, the human race, food has been the thing that has, up until very recently, when probably it was overtaken by oil as the power that powers the world, food was it. The earliest taxation was around salt. The intersection between civilization, economics, and food has been the basis of that civilization for a very long time. A desire for the sweetness of sugar was the birth of the slave trade in the Americas, and that sort of trilateral trade that brought slaves to the sugar lands, money to Europe, and then guns and things down to Africa to get more slaves. That all of these trades and all of these sort of economic rises and falls of civilizations have been very, very much around food and what we taste.
And yet, from these grand historical overviews, we can go to something as simple as the family table too. There's something there as well that makes the sharing of food so deeply human and binds us together.
Yeah, we tend to have very busy lives now, and we don't think about how important food has been. And as someone who's on the telly cooking quite a lot, food is seen by most people as a hobby, and for most people it is, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But if I think about how my grandma thought about food, it was not like, oh, my hobby is cooking. That was her purpose in life.
It's the thing I do when I've got time and I don't need Uber Eats, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Exactly. The importance of food is something that I think is actually very important, probably more so than most people. And sometimes I've got to sort of curb my enthusiasm for how important I think food is.
Do you still like to cook for your family, even if you've been spending all day cooking in front of the cameras?
Yeah, absolutely I do. And it's a very different thing.
Really? How so? What do you mean?
Not that the food is wholly different. I try to make the food that I cook on shows like The Cook Up as the kind of thing that I would cook at home. And it is absolutely the kind of thing that I do cook at home. But cooking on telly it's a different skill. I've got someone on an earpiece talking in my ear. I've got two guests in my kitchen that I'm trying to interview like you do every day. Plus I'm trying to cook. Plus I'm trying to make sure that it's entertaining for the viewers at home. And I'm sort of trying to juggle mentally about 50 things in my brain. When I'm cooking at home for my family, I have one goal, and that's to put a relatively tasty meal on the table with the minimum amount of expense, effort, and fuss.
So is it more relaxing then?
Absolutely. I will decompress after a busy day of cooking on screen by cooking again for my family.
I mentioned this before on the show, but I remember seeing an interview with Francis Ford Coppola where he said, I don't want to make big movies anymore. I'd rather just make dinner for my family because it's not a production that takes years and years, requiring millions and millions of dollars. It's something that is done very quickly. You enjoy the process of it, and you do it in the company of people you like and love, and it's all finished with the course of a couple of hours.
The Cook Up's a show that, there's probably about 60 odd people on the crew for that, and so that's a lot of moving parts. When I cook at home, it's a crew of one, and that's me, and I'm in the kitchen, and in 25 minutes I'll have dinner on the table.
You mentioned you were born in Penang, and Penang is one of those centres of that Peranakan culture, and it's got all those beautiful houses in pastel colours like parts of Singapore do as well. You left when you were 3, so you probably don't have memories from that time, but you went back quite a bit as a kid.
Yeah.
What kind of memories, what kind of pictures do you have in your head, and taste sensations, if you like, do you have when you think of a childhood going into Penang?
I just remember, we used to keep notebooks when we were young. It's something that I've actually tried to get my kids to do when we travel now. We'd keep a little notebook and we'd write a few things, but mainly draw pictures of the things that we experienced when we were going back to Malaysia. And there's so many, pictures of food, stories about food, tables of which place made the best fried chicken. These were probably the late 80s when we were doing this. And so the difference between the food that we were able... These days in Australia, you can get a huge variety of food at very, very high quality. But the variety of ingredients that you had in Australia in the 80s was not what you have now. And so there was a limited kind of repertoire of the food that you could eat, and most of it was home cooked. So that when we would go to Malaysia, it was this explosion of, we feel that at home because of what we're able to get. We just get a taste of what Malaysian Chinese food is like, and then you get to somewhere like Penang and it's just completely different.
Your mum's side of the family, Singaporean, and when you made Destination Flavour Singapore, you looked into her family history. Everyone in Singapore has stories of what happened during the Second World War when the Japanese invaded and occupied Singapore. What kind of things did you learn out about your mum's side of the family during the Japanese occupation of Singapore in World War II?
Yeah, so my mum is Eurasian. So her father was a British colonial and my grandmother was Indonesian. And as a British citizen, British subject, I don't know even how you would say it there, he was born and raised in Singapore, but he's very kind of white British, English colonial, played cricket, all that kind of thing. And so he was interned in Changi Prison during the war. And, I've just done a short documentary for Dateline on conditions in the new Changi Prison, and during Destination Flavour Singapore we saw the conditions in the old Changi Prison, and oh my goodness, that is one place you do not want to end up, no matter what you've done, or in my grandfather's case, if you haven't done anything at all other than be British. The conditions in there are not ideal, let's just say.
No, there was also the Japanese perpetrated mass murder of Chinese men of a certain age. Did the family talk a bit about that, or did they just go, at least Ed Sooners ended about that?
Not much. So on my mum's side of the family, my grandfather had died when she was about 14 or 15. And so I guess the amount that you would convey to a teenage child of that age about your terrible experiences during the war were pretty much the I don't want to talk about it level. On the other side of my family, my father, my grandfather, on my father's side, and my grandmother, they had worked in Malaysia as like housekeepers for the British colonials. There's sort of this guest house system through Malaysia where all the colonials could go out to all the parts of the province and stay in nice kind of British style houses. And my grandparents were the couple who would run that house. He would cook and she would do the laundry and make the beds and that kind of thing. And so when the Japanese took over, their administrative, process was just to take over that guest house system. So they went from working for the British to working for the Japanese.
What became of your grandfather after he was released, probably half-starved to death in Changi?
Yeah, he never really recovered from it. I think he became quite alcoholic and passed away in 55 is when he passed away, so not long after. And my mum always said that, he was never the same after his time post-occupation.
Was she close to him?
Not really. Yes and no. She wrote kind of a book about it, and she always speaks about him very fondly, but he did not have a great relationship with my grandmother, and they left, and my mum was put into convent school in Malaysia, which is how she ended up in Malaysia. And she kind of lost contact with him for a while until she got a letter from a rest home that he was convalescing in, saying that he was close to the end. And so I think she was only 14, 15 at the time, and a friend snuck out of convent school in Malaysia and hitchhiked to Singapore, and they didn't have passports, so they had to literally climb fences across the border and and things.
That's a hell of a thing to do when you're 14. Wow.
Yeah, and she got to see her father before he died.
So how did she meet your dad?
They were at medical school together. So my dad had a very different upbringing from my mum. They were in really quite poor conditions. My grandma, as I said, washed clothes and did laundry and made beds, and my grandfather was a cook in one of those guest houses. But my grandfather on my dad's side passed away when my dad was still young. So both my parents lost their fathers. My dad was 7 or 8 and my mum would have been 14, 15. My grandmother at the time wouldn't have been more than about 25, 26, 3 sons to support, and her future was not looking awfully bright, but she ended up actually winning the lottery
She
in
won the
Malaysia.
lottery?
Well, I say that and it sounds a lot more grand than it is. So I'd always been told that the amount that she won was, in today's money, inverted commas, about $5,000. But that's the story that I've been hearing for about 40 years. So today's money is probably about $25,000.
Right, but that probably went an enormously long way in
A
those days.
huge way. So essentially it was at the point where my father and his brothers were going to have to leave school to work to kind of support the family, but it allowed my grandmother to lease a cafe in Sagama in Johor Bahru, and so she operated this cafe. And all of the way that the family dynamic works in Chinese families at that time was very different. So my grandmother was looking after her own 3 boys, but then also about 10 other children from her brother-in-law's family. But essentially she was looking after a heck of a lot of children while the parents were able to go to the cities to work to make money. And so she ran a cafe and looked after a huge number of children.
So both your parents were doctors.
Yes.
And then they made the decision to migrate to Australia for your education, apparently, and largely, but also perhaps to escape the Bumiputra laws that were there in place in Malaysia as well, which disadvantaged Chinese Malaysian citizens at that time. I wonder what it was like for them to arrive in South Australia from a place where they'd been pretty well-to-do and they'd been upper middle class in terms of status as doctors, to arrive without much money at all in South Australia.
They didn't have a lot of money even in Malaysia, to be entirely honest. My father was in the army. My mother had 2 children at that point and a third when we came to Australia. And they were still very much at the start of their careers. They were in their early 30s kind of thing. They hadn't really... They probably had a brighter future ahead of them than they did currently. But when you come from Malaysia to somewhere like Australia, where the currency difference is so large, you don't have much to start with, and then
don't get a lot of dollars for your ringgits, right?
It's sort of a third of what it was back there. So I remember we lived in I think it was a 1-bedroom apartment in rural South Australia, and my dad was working for the government at that point. My mum was pregnant, so we didn't have a lot of money at all. But in terms of the opportunity that we had here, particularly my brother had shown some very positive signs of intelligence, and so they wanted to get him a really good education, and I tagged along on his coattails a little bit. So we kind of came here to go to a good school.
What are your memories of that period, growing up in this town outside of Adelaide, being in the wide open spaces for a start, and even though there's not much money, were you able to sort of roam around quite a bit?
Oh yeah, we loved it. We stayed in Keith was the name of the town for about a year and a half or so, and then moved to the suburbs of Adelaide. And I just remember the house we were living in was not huge. It was a really kind of ordinary suburban Adelaide house in a not particularly well-to-do suburb. But I just remember it was fantastic, riding around the streets on your bike and seeing the friends next door. And, we didn't have pools and things then, so we'd run around into the sprinklers, and it was just fantastic upbringing.
Your paternal grandmother, you mentioned, came to settle with the one who won the lottery, came to settle with you in Australia for a while. How much of a role did she have in bringing you up and your brother?
Oh, huge. Absolutely huge. We're a 3-generation household, so my parents were working, and my grandmother was the one that was essentially there cooking for us, feeding us.
After having brought up all those other bloody million kids as well.
Well, you could say she had quite a lot of practice, so she was quite good at it.
She got it down to a fine art with you. What was she like as a grandmother with you?
It's kind of hard to describe, because I absolutely adored my grandmother, but she wasn't, not to us anyway, she wasn't well, when we were growing up, I don't remember her being warm. It wasn't like, oh, come and sit on my knee and let me tell you a story, like that kind of thing. It was business. The business of raising a child for her was, you just got to get the stuff done. But there was food was certainly the way that she showed her love, and I know that's a bit trite and a bit of a trope, but
no, but it's real though.
It is absolutely real, and that's how, I guess, you don't realise that at the time, but it is very much a value system around food that becomes quite important.
You moved into a house with some bamboo in it. Can you explain why that bamboo was really quite troubling to you as a kid?
I'm kind of still terrified of bamboo, to be honest. Down the side of the house there was bamboo growing, which was popular in the 80s. Now I would do anything, not just because of my phobia of it, I'd do anything to get rid of bamboo in my own garden as it sneaks over from the neighbor, under the neighbour's fence. But my grandma would always tell us this story of a lady, I haven't fact-checked this, this is the story that I was told, but I'm assuming that probably other Malaysian Chinese kids were told the same thing. But you don't go into the bamboo because there's a ghost demon lady who lives at the top of the bamboo with very long nipples who will snatch you up if you play in the bamboo and spirit you away. I don't know why the nipples are integral to this part of the story, but that's just what we were told. So yeah, I was so terrified of bamboo. I think I probably went down the side of that house once, but also the side of that house, there was a corridor there inside the house. So not even outside with the bamboo, but I always remember that corridor, the speed at which I would go down that corridor, I was like Usain Bolt. Every time I had to walk through that part of the house down that near where the bamboo was, it was a sprint for me.
Was there ever a moment at night, for instance, where you think you saw that lady with the long nipples in the bamboo?
Honestly, the terror was so great, there was no chance of me going anywhere near that bamboo at night. Like, I wouldn't have been within visual sight of it.
You mentioned your brother was kind of spotted as a gifted kid, and that's true for you as well. You started school at the age of 4 in year 1. Was that to get you out of the house, or was it because
genuinely,
you were
I think so. I didn't even, whatever they call it these days across different straits, prep or kindy or whatever. I just assumed that school started at year 1, but apparently there was another year ahead of that I was allowed to skip. I don't know why parents do that, and when I asked my parents, like, why would you want to put a 4-year-old, like I'd literally just turned 4, into year 1, and they're like, oh, you were handling the schoolwork fine. It's like, it's not about schoolwork, it's about being 4 when everyone else is sort of 7.
Did you feel that if you're going through that young, and how old were you when you finished high school?
15.
15. Were you conscious and a little bit sort of troubled by knowing that all the other kids around you were more mature than you were?
Kind of, in the sense that, I enjoy sport, but when you're that much younger than everybody else, you can't really participate in it in that sense. And I guess in that period of time, sport is such an important thing to a school kid, a school boy, essentially. And I went to an all-boys school, and I think in terms of emotional maturity, I was going to say I was okay, but I was pretty immature. Let's be entirely honest. I remember my teachers being impressed that I could do things academically, but being very, very disappointed at my emotional maturity in class. Like practical jokes, pranks, that kind of thing. But yeah, I have great friends from school who I am still really great friends with today, and we go away once or twice a year somewhere and reminisce about those times. So in terms of social interaction, I think I was fine, but yeah, definitely was more immature than the rest.
Were you aware of a culture that wanted to punish you for being an overachiever academically? And how did you calibrate your schoolwork? Did you do just enough to pass or get by, or were you a hard worker and got high results as a result of that?
I got good results. I mean, I don't want to seem flippant. I didn't have to work particularly hard for them, to be entirely honest. At that point, when I was going through my university entry exams, my parents had divorced, and so I was living with my brother at the time, and my grandmother was spending a lot of her time there as well, back and forth between Australia and Malaysia. So it wasn't exactly the most conducive to study environment. I didn't do a heck of a lot of studying. I still did fine at school, but it wasn't like, I'm going to work really hard and get the best marks I possibly can, because, you come home to a house that had no parents in it, no adults. And so my brother, who was already at university at the time, he was still only 17.
Oh my God.
And I would have been 14, 15.
And your grandmother was also there for a while?
She was, but she would spend extended periods in Malaysia and then in Australia as well. So probably 6 months of the year we'd be on our own.
Is that when you learned to cook?
Yeah, absolutely.
What's it like in Adelaide in the 80s? I mean, were there a lot of Asian groceries? There's a Chinatown around Guja Street, around that part of Adelaide, but were there any Chinese groceries you could get the ingredients from?
Not really at that point, but that Chinatown in Adelaide was very much the centre of our community. And so people would just go into the city where the Chinatown was to do the grocery shopping from all those things. And I can tell you the main grocery store that we would go to, I've been there countless times. I can do the layout of it and where every single ingredient is in that shop, and I probably haven't been there for 20 years.
Fish sauce aisle 3.
Exactly.
You ended up doing a double degree in law and science at university, even though you came from a medical family. Was this because you loved the law, or how did you end up doing law?
I think this comes back to the immaturity thing. I didn't really know what I wanted to do when I left school.
Well, how could you, Adam?
Well, Yeah, I think that's a structural issue.
Yeah.
I don't want to go into that too much, but I don't think you should push kids through school too fast. Just from my own experience, I think 14, 15 is too young to try to decide what you want to do. But, my brother and sister, they went on to do medicine like my parents did. For me, it was a little bit more casual, I guess. I arranged to have lunch with a friend, and he was like, I'm actually going to go and put in my application for law school, so I don't think we can have lunch today. I said, I'll just tag along with you, and we put in applications together and both ended up in law school.
Oh, it was like that casual?
Yeah.
Once you found yourself doing it, though, was it interesting to you?
I loved it, yeah. And I don't want to draw too long a bow here, but with cooking, with law, with whatever it happens to be, there's this theoretical way of trying to work out how the world works. Cooking is very cultural, biological. Legal is administrative, but it does tell you a huge amount about society and why we've structured society in a particular way, and where it can be improved, where it needs to be improved, where it's weak, where it's strong. I really enjoyed the legal theory aspect of law school.
What do you think the law is there for? Is it to bring out the best in human beings or to constrain us from our worst aspect?
Well, that's a very big question, Richard. I think it's essentially there to provide a system by which we can all get along. Left to our own devices, we would devolve into something that we probably can't structure a society around, so we need that legal structure to stop us from that devolution.
Right, so it's a different recourse to violence, in other words, and the rule of the strong at the same time. Do you have a view of human nature that's based on? Do you think people are fundamentally good or fundamentally bad, and therefore we need the law in order to not be as bad as we could otherwise be?
It's changing every day, Richard, let me tell you. I think humans, good and bad, are quite relative. I think human beings are essentially self-interested. Our biology tells us that. Our legal structure tells us that, in the sense that we essentially make laws to stop people from thinking only in their self-interest. Our society is collective, individuals are individual, and so we will always act in our own self-interest at the end of the day.
So the law's there to guide us to enlightened self-interest then?
Yeah, our biology is the same way. We will protect people of our own bloodline in the natural world. Animals will feed their nephews and nieces in the animal kingdom, and they will be more likely to protect their own in that circumstance. And in a human society, we have our own views of what are our own. Do we act in the interest of all Australians? Do we act in the interest of our immediate family? And even though that might be seen as generosity, it is, I think, fundamentally self-interest in some way. In the biological sense, it allows the certain number of genes that you might share with that niece or nephew to continue to subsequent generations. But in, I guess, a human civilization, it allows the values that we hold, the values that we coalesce around as a civilization, it allows those to persist.
So after you graduated, you took a job with the Disney Corporation in Tokyo. And how old were you when you went to Tokyo?
I'd been working as a lawyer in law firms for 4 or 5 years at that point, and I was 23, I think, when I went to Tokyo.
Right. So I'm just thinking how different Japan is, its culture, how different its culture, its food culture is from that you'd known in Southeast Asia and in Australia as well. Were you at a bit of a loss when you first dropped yourself into Tokyo and began to work there?
I'd never, other than the job interview, I had never been to Tokyo or Japan before.
Oh, right.
I had no interest in going there. I was offered a very cool job, so decided to take it, and I thought it'd be fun for a few years. And I was completely stuck. I couldn't speak Japanese. I was living in a hotel for about 3 months until I found an apartment. But it was fascinating at the same time. I'd never really lived outside of Adelaide as a non-child. So it was really interesting to me, but it was also...
Adelaide to Tokyo. Wow.
It was a dramatic change, but it was so much fun. I just remember going, oh, wow. So it was very popular at the time, for young lawyers to want to spread their wings and, with British ancestry, the obvious choice for me was to go to London like half of the other members of my graduating classes. But Tokyo just seemed like a much more interesting option, so that's where I ended up.
And what did you cook when you first got there?
I tried to cook the same way that I've been cooking in Australia, and I remember with no language skills and the ingredients. Like these days, you can get quite a lot of different ingredients in the supermarket, but I couldn't find any that I could really recognise at that point. And so I ended up going to a very fancy actually American supermarket and buying some ingredients just for a simple pasta that I'd been making, and ended up spending about $150 on the ingredients for pasta for one. And I was like, this has to change. I'm going to have to start to learn to cook some Japanese food because, I can't keep going across town to the one foreign supermarket to buy foreign ingredients every time. I'm just going to have to adapt to what I have in front of me.
And you speak Japanese now.
Now I do, yeah.
How were you learning Japanese? Were you picking it up on the street, or were you learning it from other ways?
Just with friends, actually. I'd started working for Disney, which at that point, the language of the company was English, and so we'd do meetings in English, and that was the reason. My role was a regional role, so I was working in English the whole time. But after I'd been there for about 3 or 4 years, there was a shift. I had a lot of Japanese friends, and so I'd go out for dinner and learn the language by osmosis in that way. But then after about 3 years, the company said, we've worked out that there's a company of a couple of thousand people, and there were literally 2 guys who couldn't speak Japanese there. It was me and the guy in the office next to me. So like, let's make a switch to Japanese and be a Japanese company. And so he and I had to sort of step it up and learn a bit more Japanese.
See, my favourite of your Destination Flavour series is Destination Flavour Japan. It's so different from the one you made in Singapore. You sort of allowing yourself to submit to the magnetic pull of Japan and your own curiosity for what you've found out, but you still had lots more to find out as well. And so it was this lovely mix of you telling us what you know, but also finding out stuff you didn't know at the same time. Have you sort of never lost that kind of crazy love of Japanese culture and Japanese food?
That was the first show I'd ever presented solo as a TV presenter. I had a really good director who was telling me, a lot of TV presenters will come into things and think they have to be the expert on everything, but you don't want to turn a TV show, which is supposed to be pleasurable, into a lecture. And so you have to have this little bit of wonderment and this authentic journey. You can't lie on television. You can't pretend to be something you're not. And I am quite fascinated by Japanese food, and I learn about it. I speak Japanese now. I'm there 5 times a year. So I am in that culture a lot, but I still, every single day, learn new things about it that I find endlessly fascinating.
You married your Japanese wife, and then you applied for Australian Masterchef. Was this a way of trying to escape the tyranny of corporate life, or was it another bit of whimsy like you applying for law?
It was pretty whimsical, to be honest. I loved my old job. It was great. It's the kind of job when you say that you work for Disney, and to a lawyer, that job is the kind of job that everybody wants to get. And I feel very privileged to be in that position.
And when your kids got older, did they go, wait, what? You used to work for Disneyland and you quit? Was it like that?
Well, my wife actually worked for the same company, so we both worked for Disney. And so the kids, we still have a lot of friends back there, so we go to Disneyland quite a lot and get a few free tickets from the old co-workers and things like that. But yeah, it was kids rarely impressed with anything their parents do, but that's certainly one that when they were a bit younger, they were very happy with.
After you won, you became insanely famous for a while. I know you're quite necessarily quite a private person. You like to keep the privacy of your family in place. But did you experience that thing? When you go out, you're used to being a private person on the street, but you're not really anymore. And you kind of feel that insanely awkward self-consciousness. Did you go through a period of that?
Very much so. It's not just the shock of going from nobody recognising you to everybody recognising you, but it was, firstly, I'd been in Japan, and I was still living in Japan, actually, when I won Masterchef. And then in the actual Masterchef process, these days you kind of go back your regular life, but in those days I'd been living in one room with 20 other people for the last 9 months before that, and then coming out into this really strange, I hadn't lived in Australia for 10 years at the time, and I remember one time we had one day off and you were allowed to do whatever you wanted on that day, go out into society rather than be locked up in the Masterchef house. I just went to the movies and I saw 3 movies in a row because I just didn't know what to do. It was definitely a real shock for me, and it wasn't bad. People would recognise you on the street for doing something good or doing something that they thought was fun. So the interactions were pretty positive.
Yeah. But God knows I love Australia. I love Australians, but they do have this habit of stating the bleeding obvious all the time. They'll tend to bowl up to you and they go, "Hey, you're Adam Liaw from Masterchef." And what are you supposed to say to that? "Yes, I am." Or
it's To this day, that's pretty much exactly how it goes. And
it's like when you arrive at the office in a suit, they go, "Oh, you're wearing a suit today." Australians do that. They like that. I think it's actually a way of taking people down a peg in some way.
Well, I get quite often because people recognise me from TV. It tends to be something that people, I don't know, for some reason people don't like to admit it. Maybe we all grew up in that era where it was kind of a passion. I never watched TV, so I get people recognise me an awful lot. I mean, I work in TV, for the last 15 years, but you get people say, "Oh, my mum watches you on TV," or "My wife loves you," or "My kids watch your show every night." You never get people that say, "I watch your show every night." Well, you do. For the most part, men will tell you that somebody else in their life watches you on TV.
Right, yeah. Oh, yeah, my wife really likes what you do. Yeah, that sort of thing. First on TV, you were often making incredibly complex, exquisite things, like famously the snow egg with which you won Masterchef, and other things I've seen you make in Destination Flavour, which are incredibly complex and exquisite. That's not what you're doing now on TV now. Have you changed as a cook, or has your philosophy of cooking changed over the years?
Yeah, hugely. I think at that time, cooking was very much a hobby for me. We didn't have kids at that time. And cooking was just like almost a form of creative expression, which it is for me now, but it is also the most practical thing that I can do. It is a necessity. I have to cook. And I may as well try to do that to a relatively high standard where I'm not spending too much money or too much time to do that thing. And so I like solving the puzzle. I look at dinner as being a puzzle to solve, like a little crossword or a Sudoku or something.
Or a legal case.
Exactly.
It's the same kind of structural thinking.
Absolutely. And so I try to get a meal on the table using the fewest number of ingredients with the least amount of time for the greatest possible return, producing the least amount of food waste. I love taking the end bits of broccoli that we put in the crisper and then stir-frying up the end bits of 5 different stalks of broccoli because the kids have eaten all the florets in the week previous. I still absolutely love cooking, but it's a very, very different thing. I get a huge amount of, there's so many recipes that exist in the world today. If I'm going to write another one, it's not, "Hey, everyone, look at how clever I am. I've written a great recipe." It's to solve a problem. I write a recipe so that it exists for a purpose. Maybe it's something that somebody might like, but I found a faster way of doing it or an easier way of doing it or a cheaper way of doing it or a substitute of an ingredient that is more readily available so you don't have to go to a specialty shop to buy it.
I've seen Gordon Ramsay a few times on his Kitchen Nightmares show, which I enjoy more than I ought to, I think. I've seen him do this a few times where he's grabbed some poor restaurateur by the ear into a good Italian restaurant and bring him in front of the waiter or the chef and ask this weary but very experienced and knowledgeable and wise chef, what's the essential principles of good food? And he'll go, simplicity and freshness, and then walk back into the kitchen. Do you like that as a philosophy, or is that too simple?
It's a pretty good philosophy. A chef in a restaurant would probably keep it to those two things. I think the practicality of the dishes that you cook in your own home kitchen is sort of an additional element, because what I cook in my kitchen is not going to resonate with me in the same way that what you cook in your kitchen would resonate with you. I could show you exactly what I cook in my kitchen 7 nights a week. And I don't think anyone else other than me should cook like that because it's not authentic to them. They have different preferences. They have different cultural inputs. They have a different amount of time that they want to spend in the kitchen to produce that thing. So finding the things in your repertoire that are meaningful to you, I think, is really important. If it was just simplicity and freshness, everyone would cook the same thing. But there's a personality that I think you have to bring to your own food. Part of the reason that I think cooking is so important is because it allows you to be in charge of that personality for your family, for yourself. Even if you take the family side of it out of the equation, like you are very much, and I don't mean this in the health context, defined by what you eat, or maybe it doesn't define you, but it is an expression of who you are, the things that you like, the things that you're willing to spend time on. We only have a certain number of minutes in the day, and if you're going to apply those minutes to cooking dinner, would be very sad to me if it was just about fuel, about keeping it as simple as possible, or I could eat jam on toast every night, but that would, to me, my life would not have the richness that it has. So we tend to look at food as being this very practical thing, which it is, but it is also this opportunity to add some joy into the life in something that is so practical that you are going to do every day, or at least 3 days a week or 5 days a week, how often it is that you cook. It would be very sad to me if my life was just, the same 5 things that I order on an app that get delivered to me, and that's what I eat.
You're a really hard-working guy. You're You're making recipes, you're making television, you make podcasts, you work very hard. Is that something that's become a thing in your life since you've had kids? Is it something you like to be that hardworking, or is it something that's more like a habit you can't break now?
I mean, you learn it from your parents. I always remember my dad, I never saw him in bed or rest or watch TV, or I don't think I've ever seen him do those things when I was growing up. He would always be awake before I woke up, asleep after I went to sleep. If you saw him, he was doing something practical and positive, mowing the lawn, fixing a fence, and then sometimes he'd sneak inside and sit down and have a glass of water and fall asleep for literally 3 minutes and then get back up and go and do the next task.
And are you that man now?
We inevitably turn into your parents. I guess the way that I have changed is that, yes, I am still very hardworking, but I don't see that as being necessarily a good thing. I think we are told that, regardless of your race, religion, upbringing, if you say someone is not a hard worker, that is morally bad. And if someone is a hard worker, that is morally good. We are so programmed to consider hard work as being pretty much the one unassailable moral good that everyone should be to be an upstanding citizen in whatever society you happen to live in. We also use it as a stick to beat people who we perceive as not hardworking. And I think there is a bit of, not a bit, but quite a lot of falseness to that. We tend to just assume that everyone who is financially successful has worked harder than everyone who is not financially successful. And then if it's obvious that you can't become the richest person in the world just from putting in 110% effort, then we just assume that they're geniuses. And so you have this kind of combination of this idea that hard work needs to be morally good in order to succeed, but now you have generations of young people now who can't work any harder than they already do. And some of them have 3 or 4 jobs, but they still can't afford to buy a house and those kind of things. I think that there's a lot of negatives from this idea that hard work is a moral good. I think hard work is an individual good. I like being active. I like the feeling of accomplishment that I get when I have washed my car, But this idea...
Do you like not working, though? That's my question. Because I'm finding I've got problems with this. Like the whole idea of just relaxing on a beach somewhere. I can do that for a short while, and then I start to go,
I don't think I could do it even for a short while. I think the ability to relax is something that we should all aspire to. I'm very, very bad at that. If I'm on holiday, I deliberately will take work with me on holiday so that I don't have downtime, because I find that if I do, like most people, you find you work really hard towards going on holiday, and then the first day of your holiday you get sick because something subconsciously in your brain has told you don't need to stay alert anymore, and then you just automatically get sick. So I deliberately, these days, I'll make sure I have some work to do so that subconsciously I won't get sick on my holiday with my family.
Maybe that's one of the reasons why you like cooking for your family every night, is because it's a nice segue. Yeah. From the work of the day. It's something you can probably do almost automatically now because you know what you're cooking, and that can help you as a kind of a segue into actually relaxing with the family then around the table.
Yeah, maybe. The thing I don't like about my approach to hard work is that I actually will feel guilty. If I sit down and watch the footy, which is something I very much enjoy doing, I will feel guilty. And nobody's making me feel guilty. No, my wife is not nagging me saying, get up and do some, re-stump the fence or whatever. Nobody's
Adam
saying
is
that.
Go and lift something heavy. No, Adam is making Adam feel guilty.
Yeah. I make myself feel guilty for taking 2 hours in my day to watch my footy team.
Well, Adam, we're all the beneficiaries of your hard work. It's been wonderful speaking with you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Richard.
Today's conversation with Adam Liaw was made on the lands of the Gadigal people. Producer was Alice Moldovan. Executive producer, Nicola Harrison. I'm Richard Fidler. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.